So our passage here is 1 Corinthians 11:3, and it's Paul writing to the Christians at Corinth. But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of his wife, and God is the head of Christ.
Well, I want to start with asking you, how have you seen in your ministry and professional life this verse being misused?
Mm-hmm. Well, having grown up in evangelical context, I actually heard this verse quite a lot. And it was used to say, this is the way that God has structured the family for all time. You know, man is the head of woman, or a husband is the head of the wife. And this is God ordained, and this is the way that we need to be in a family. And so that never sat very well with me. So I'm wondering, what do we do with this passage?
So, and this is the conversation I want us both to have, because I think you're just as well equipped to answer what do we do with this as I am. But the way I see it, I think we have two choices at the top here. We can say, Paul doesn't mean what we think Paul means. And so we can figure out, what did Paul really mean? And usually that's a way to justify Paul. It's sort of saying, if we have this inerrantist Bible where it's always right, we have to just figure out how it's right. And so we'll do some deep dive into language and context. And a lot of times that's actually really helpful and beneficial. In this case, I'm going to question whether that's true or not. Mm-hmm. Because the other side is just to say, I think maybe Paul was a part of his context and time and location where this was the view of men and women in the structure of things, and that was just assumed. And now maybe we need to move past that and reconfigure and reimagine our theology based on a different social location where men and women are equal and the man is not the head of the woman. So if we go to the let's justify Paul side, I think we break that down into two pieces. Usually more progressives who would be egalitarian, who want to sort of have it be that men and women are of equal authority and of equal value, will say something like, the head of doesn't mean authority. Right. It means something like the source, like the certain, like a lake is the head of a certain river. Yeah. And so it's not talking about authority or primacy at all. It just originates from. Maybe it goes back to the story of Adam and Eve and how the woman originates from the man and the man originates from God. That's the narrative. It's not talking about authority or primacy.
Right. I've heard that so much in moderate contexts. People trying to move away from that interpretation, but still trying to keep Paul authoritative.
Paul authoritative. Yeah. Right. So we can do that. That's one way of doing it. I think the challenge of that is when we look at the way Paul uses the word head, often he uses it with Christ, and there is clearly this authoritative element to it. So we'd have to do more explaining if we're going to go that route. Right. But we could go the more conservative route or the complementarian route, which is often to say, no, Paul does mean authority. He does mean the man is ahead of the woman, but it doesn't mean better than. It doesn't mean more valuable than. Right. There still is authority, and you do need to submit as a woman, but that's not better. It's just a different role. Right. And for me, that really doesn't hold water. That feels like gaslighting. Like, no, it's separate but equal. Like, that doesn't usually always work out real well. Right. So I would personally think that's a terrible explanation. But this more progressive side, maybe there is something to Paul doesn't mean what we think Paul means. Maybe it's not an authoritative word. Do you have any thoughts on what you think about that particular interpretation, or if there's others that might help us in that scope of maybe Paul was right and maybe we're just misunderstanding the context here?
Yeah, I think it's really hard when it comes to the words because we just really don't know how Paul is using this word head, and he tends to use it as a metaphor in all these different ways. And so I think that road is not going to lead us to a really helpful solution. We could talk about how, Paul tends to make these arguments, like kind of complicated arguments, and his argument here is about women covering their head, and so he makes several different moves about talking about head, but again, they don't make sense in our context. So I don't know if that's even the way that we can go. I mean, do you have other ways that you think that we could go?
Well, no, I mean, I do think, and I think that's important because sometimes I think we assume, speaking of context, that the way we think of logical arguments is the same as the ancient world. Right. So when Paul's making these arguments, we're trying to make sense of it in the way we think of logic, where the way they read texts and the way they put logic together we would scratch our heads sometimes at the way Paul and Jesus and some of the other New Testament writers make these arguments.
Right.
And so I think that, again, points me more toward it's a different social location. It's a different context. And our being sort of hell-bent on inerrancy, that it has to be right, has led us to accept some things that when I step back and if I don't have to have inerrancy, I'm really stretching my imagination to see how this all works out. So let's maybe go to that second option, which is, what does it mean if Paul's just maybe wrong on this? Like maybe he's more right, maybe he's more progressive than his time, but not up to 21st century ethical standards.
Sure.
What does that mean for how we read Paul?
I think it just means that we have to realize that Paul is not the be-all, end-all of how we live our lives, right? Like we have to understand that he is in an ancient context and he's in a Roman environment where the household is the core of the whole society. And if he messes with that, like that's not a road he probably needs to go down. So we just have to put him in his context and say, maybe this is not where we need to go to talk about how the family should be structured.
Right. And that really does then bring us squarely back to the questions we ask at the Bible for Normal People. What is the Bible then, and what do we do with it? And how do we have a Bible that can remain authoritative in some sense? Or maybe authoritative is not the right word. Maybe it can still be a guide and a tool in the toolkit of our faith while not being this inerrant, it has to be exactly right, and we have to figure it out. We have to justify Paul so that we can maintain this idea of what the Bible is. If we let that go, I think some of these passages, we can just at least breathe a little easier to say, okay, maybe I just don't know. Maybe Paul's not really up to 21st century standards here, and that's okay. And I think that's going to be a challenge for a lot of people.
Yeah, but I think it's good news for women everywhere.